I was 62 years old the night everything changed, though I had no way of knowing it then. The old farmhouse had become far too quiet after my divorce. For 36 years every room had carried the sound of another person walking, laughing, complaining about little things, or humming while making coffee. Now the loudest sound most evenings was the grandfather clock in the hallway, reminding me that time never waited for anyone. I had learned to keep myself busy. I fixed broken fences for neighbors, tended a small vegetable garden, and spent long afternoons reading books I had ignored during my marriage. People often told me that retirement was supposed to feel peaceful. Sometimes it did. Most nights it just felt empty. That particular evening a cold rain tapped gently against the windows while I sat in my favorite chair, holding a mug of black coffee that had already gone cold. I looked across the room at the framed family photos still sitting on the fireplace. My daughter Emily smiled in every picture. My former wife Karen smiled too, though looking at those photographs no longer filled me with anger. Only quiet memories remained. Divorce changes more than a marriage. Changes the way silence feels. I had accepted that some chapters simply ended without anyone getting the ending they imagined. At exactly 12:15 someone knocked on my front door. Not once. 3 slow, steady knocks. Nobody visited this late. Especially not during heavy rain. For a moment I considered pretending I had not heard it. Then the knocking came again. A little louder this time. Something about it felt unusually calm, almost respectful. I pulled on my old jacket, grabbed the flashlight from the hallway table, and walked toward the front door. When I opened it I froze. Standing beneath the porch light, completely soaked from the rain, was my former boss, Richard Sullivan. I had not seen him in nearly 14 years. Back when I worked for Sullivan Manufacturing, Richard had been known as one of the toughest executives in the entire state. He rarely smiled. He expected perfection from everyone, including himself. Most employees respected him. Many feared him. I had been somewhere in between. Tonight, however, the confident businessman looked like someone carrying an invisible weight. His gray hair was wetter than I had ever seen it. His expensive coat clung heavily to his shoulders. For several long seconds neither of us spoke. Finally he looked directly into my eyes. "David, I hope I am not too late." His voice sounded different. Softer. Almost uncertain. I stepped aside without thinking. "You better come inside before you catch pneumonia." He gave a tired smile and quietly entered the house. As I closed the door behind him I could not stop wondering why a man I had not spoken to in over a decade had driven across town after midnight just to see me. Whatever brought him here, it was clearly important. And somehow I had the feeling my quiet life was about to change forever. I handed Richard a dry towel while he stood near the fireplace warming his hands. He thanked me with a nod that seemed unusually humble for someone who once controlled the careers of hundreds of employees. I made a fresh pot of coffee. Old habits die hard. Whenever difficult conversations appeared, coffee somehow made them easier. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. For several minutes the only sound came from rain hitting the roof. Richard looked around the room, slowly noticing the old family photographs, the books stacked neatly beside the window, and the worn wooden table where my family had once shared thousands of meals. "You kept this place exactly the same," he finally said. I smiled faintly. "Some things are easier to leave alone." He lowered his eyes. "Not everything should stay the same." There was something in those words that caught my attention. This was not a social visit. He had come carrying something much heavier than memories. Before I could ask another question, Richard reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully placed a thick sealed envelope on the table between us. He rested his hand on it for a long moment without letting go. "I have carried this with me for years, David. Longer than I should have." I looked at the envelope but made no move to touch it. "What is it?" He leaned back in his chair and slowly exhaled. "The answer to a mistake I never had the courage to admit." His words settled heavily in the room. I searched his face, trying to understand. During all the years we had worked together, Richard had never apologized for anything. Not once. Seeing regret written across his face felt almost impossible. Outside, the storm continued, growing stronger. Inside my little farmhouse, another kind of storm had quietly begun. I had no idea what was inside that envelope, but every instinct told me opening it would force both of us to confront a past neither of us had truly left behind. I reached toward it slowly while Richard watched without saying another word. The moment my fingers touched the paper, I realized this unexpected midnight visit was about far more than either of us had imagined. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt, as if every year Richard had carried it had added another layer of weight. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded several documents along with a handwritten letter. The first page stopped me cold. It was a company report from 15 years earlier, the same year I had quietly accepted an early retirement package after being blamed for a costly production failure. Back then I believed I had simply made one mistake too many. Richard had never argued when the board suggested it was time for me to leave. I walked away with my pride bruised but without making a scene. I told myself life was too short to spend fighting over something that could not be changed. Now as I looked across the table, Richard lowered his eyes. "That report was never accurate," he said softly. I looked back at the paperwork. Several pages contained handwritten corrections and signatures I had never seen before. Another page revealed internal emails showing that equipment maintenance had been delayed despite repeated warnings from several supervisors. One of those warnings carried my own signature. I remembered filing those reports and wondering why nobody ever responded. Richard rubbed his hands together nervously. "You tried to stop that failure before it happened. The board never saw your reports. Someone removed them before the investigation began." For a long moment I could not speak. The memories returned all at once. The awkward farewell lunch. The sympathetic looks from coworkers. Emily telling me everything would be all right even though she knew how much losing that career hurt me. Karen trying to stay positive while our marriage was already beginning to fall apart. One decision had quietly changed every part of my life. I had blamed myself for years. Now I was staring at proof that the story I believed had never been the whole truth. Still one question remained. "If you knew this," Richard the First finally asked, "why wait so long?" He stared into his untouched coffee before answering. "Because I convinced myself protecting the company mattered more than protecting one good man." Those words landed harder than I expected. Richard continued speaking without looking at me. "The board wanted stability. Investors wanted confidence. Finding one person to carry the blame solved everything quickly. I told myself you would recover. That life would move on. Instead I watched from a distance while your entire future changed because I stayed silent." The room grew impossibly still. I wanted to feel angry. Maybe I should have. Instead I mostly felt tired. There comes an age when carrying resentment requires more energy than forgiveness. Still, forgiveness is never immediate. It asks difficult questions first. Richard slowly reached into his coat again and placed another folder beside the first. This one contained photographs of company events, newspaper articles, and a recent financial report. The final page showed something surprising. Sullivan Manufacturing had been sold only 6 months earlier. Richard noticed my expression. After the sale I finally retired. For the first time in 40 years I had nothing distracting me from my conscience. I started thinking about everyone whose lives crossed mine. Most memories faded. Yours never did. I drove past this farmhouse twice before tonight. Both times I turned around because I lacked the courage to knock. This evening I realized if I waited any longer I might lose the chance forever. His honesty caught me off guard. The man sitting across from me barely resembled the executive I once worked for. Age had softened him in ways success never could. He looked less like a wealthy businessman and more like someone searching for peace. He slid one final document toward me. It was addressed in my name. Inside was a certified letter confirming a substantial financial settlement created from Richard's personal retirement funds. I looked up immediately. "I cannot accept this." He nodded as though expecting the response. "I know you will say that. But this is not charity. It is accountability. Nothing can return the years you lost. Nothing can repair your marriage or restore the opportunities that disappeared. But perhaps this can prevent one mistake from defining the rest of both our lives." I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed by emotions I had not expected to feel. Money had never been the real loss. The hardest part had been believing I failed my family. Believing I had disappointed myself. Now those beliefs were beginning to crack. Richard stood and walked toward the living room where the old family photograph still rested above the fireplace. He studied one picture of Emily graduating from college. You always talked about your daughter at work, he said with a faint smile. You never missed one of her school events. I admired that even if I never said it. I walked beside him. She lives 3 states away now. She calls every Sunday. He smiled gently. Then you did something right after all. Those simple words carried more comfort than he probably realized. 4 years I had measured my worth by one painful chapter. Maybe I had overlooked the better chapters that came afterward. The rain outside had finally begun to ease. A thin strip of moonlight appeared through the clouds, casting pale light across the living room floor. Richard picked up his coat. I should go. You have given me more kindness tonight than I deserved. I walked him to the front door. Before stepping outside, he paused. There is one more thing you deserve to know, David. Someone else has been searching for you too. Someone connected to everything that happened back then. I frowned slightly. Who? Richard gave a slow, thoughtful smile. Tomorrow morning you will probably find out. Then without another word he stepped into the cool night and disappeared down the porch steps. I stood in the doorway long after his car vanished into the darkness. The envelope remained on my kitchen table. My past had finally begun revealing the truth. But as I locked the front door, I realized Richard's visit had uncovered only the beginning. Whoever was coming next carried a piece of the story that even he could not finish. I barely slept that night. The papers remained spread across my kitchen table, while I sat beside the window watching the first light of morning slowly brighten the fields around my farmhouse. For the first time in many years, I no longer questioned whether I had failed at the job I once loved. The truth had finally found its way home. Still, Richard's final words echoed through my mind. Someone else has been searching for you too. Around 9 that morning, another car pulled into my driveway. This time I recognized neither the vehicle nor the woman who stepped out. She appeared to be in her early 50s, carrying a leather folder close to her chest. When I opened the door, she smiled politely. David Marshall. I nodded. She extended her hand. My name is Linda Brooks. I worked in your company's legal department years ago. I have been trying to find you for months. I invited her inside and poured another cup of coffee. It seemed my kitchen had become a place where long-hidden truths finally surfaced. Linda carefully opened her folder. Inside were copies of the same reports Richard had shown me, along with several additional documents. She looked directly at me. I kept copies because something never felt right about your investigation. After I retired, I started organizing old files. That is when I realized important records had disappeared from the official archive. I contacted Richard earlier this year. At first he refused to discuss it. Then one day he called me back and admitted everything. She paused before continuing. He told me he wanted to make things right before it was too late. Hearing someone else confirm the story removed the last remaining doubt from my heart. For 15 years I had carried blame that never belonged to me. Linda reached into the folder one last time and handed me a faded photograph. It showed a company picnic from decades earlier. There I was standing beside Richard, smiling while our families laughed together. I stared at that picture for several moments. Somewhere along the way, ambition, fear, and pride had erased the friendship we once shared. Linda smiled gently. People remember mistakes. Photographs remind us they were once just ordinary people trying to build ordinary lives. After she left, I carried the photograph into the living room and placed it beside the family pictures. Not because I wanted to forget what happened, but because I no longer wanted one painful chapter to erase every good memory that came before it. That afternoon I called Emily. As always, she answered on the second ring. Dad, everything all right? For the first time in years, I answered with complete honesty. Everything finally is. I told her the entire story, from Richard's visit to Linda's documents. She remained quiet until I finished. Then she laughed softly. Dad, do you know what I remember most from those years? I admitted I did not. I remember you coaching my softball team, helping me with homework, teaching me how to drive. You think losing that job defined your life. It never defined mine. To me, you were always the man who showed up. Her words reached a place inside me that no legal document ever could. Sometimes the people we love see our true value long before we do. The following weekend, Richard asked if he could visit again. This time he arrived during the afternoon carrying a homemade apple pie instead of an envelope. We sat on the back porch overlooking the garden. The conversation came easier than either of us expected. We talked about retirement, grandchildren, old coworkers, and the strange ways life humbles everyone eventually. At one point, Richard looked across the fields and quietly said, "Thank you for opening the door that night." I smiled. "You still had to walk through it." He laughed for the first time since I had seen him again. It was the same laugh I remembered from many years earlier before board meetings and quarterly reports became the center of his world. Over the next several months we stayed in touch. Not because the past disappeared, but because both of us finally stopped running from it. Richard used part of his retirement to establish a scholarship for students studying engineering and ethics, believing future leaders should never separate success from integrity. He asked if I would help select the recipients each year. I accepted, not because I wanted recognition, but because I believed something good should grow from what had once caused so much pain. Life slowly settled into a different rhythm. The farmhouse no longer felt quite as lonely. Emily visited more often, bringing my grandchildren, who filled every room with laughter that echoed through the old walls. The vegetable garden grew larger than ever. Neighbors stopped by more frequently. Even the quiet evenings felt different. Not empty, peaceful. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had ignored those 3 quiet knocks after midnight. Perhaps Richard would have driven away carrying his burden forever. Perhaps I would have continued believing a lie about myself. Instead, one unexpected visit reminded 2 aging men that courage is not found in avoiding the truth. It is found in finally facing it. My divorce had taught me that some relationships end. My former career taught me that reputations can be damaged. But forgiveness taught me something greater. A broken past does not have to decide the rest of your future. Every sunrise offers another chance to choose kindness over bitterness, honesty over pride, and hope over regret. Sometimes everything changes not because the past disappears, but because someone finally has the courage to knock on your door, and someone else finds the courage to answer. The end.